Hello, this is Tessa Kegel, and this is HBS5OHC, Identifying and Controlling Hazards, Mitigation of Health Impacts, Environmental and Biological Monitoring, and this is part 1 of 3. This is the Commonwealth of Australia Copyright Act 1968, which covers this series of lectures. So the objectives for this module are to access, interpret and synthesize the application of environmental and biological monitoring to mitigate health effects of hazards in the workplace, to identify the appropriate requirements for and use of expert assistance to assist with the monitoring of hazardous environmental and biological substances in the workplace, to articulate the basic principles of environmental and biological monitoring in relation to the protection of workers from the effects of hazardous substances, and to appropriately synthesize and apply environmental and biological monitoring information to inform the ongoing evaluation and maintenance of a safe system for prevention of the health impacts of hazardous substances exposures. In this module, we look at monitoring the environment and the exposure of workers to substances in that environment. Health assessment and monitoring are important components for management of workers' exposures to hazardous substances. Any form of monitoring is only useful if results are used to inform hazard management and if these results form part of an overall risk management approach to OHS. Monitoring in isolation only measures the extent of any particular exposure. Employers have an obligation to inform prospective or current work of any risks or hazards associated with the work undertaken. We have previously identified primary, secondary and tertiary prevention of workplace-related injury and disease as the cornerstones of occupational health practice. Monitoring and the reasons for undertaking monitoring are part of the larger picture of prevention and management of hazardous occupational and environmental exposures. Environmental monitoring is used to measure record changes within the environment over time. The results of environmental monitoring are a different measure to what an individual person is absorbing. This latter measurement forms part of biological monitoring. Biological monitoring of exposure to occupational toxins is the evaluation of the internal exposure of the organism to a toxic agent using a biological method. Together with environmental monitoring, it can be used to detect problems in workplaces related to exposure of workers to toxic substances. If biological monitoring is carried out regularly and at an early stage, when intervention can improve the outcome and before the human is damaged, biological monitoring becomes a form of secondary prevention. Environmental sampling and monitoring. Commonly in OHS, when we discuss environmental monitoring in a workplace, we are referring to atmospheric monitoring. Atmospheric monitoring involves the use of suitable techniques to obtain an estimate of the exposure of employees to airborne substances through inhalation. For work-related exposures, the results of the monitoring are then compared to regulated standards to ascertain whether or not the exposure of workers to hazardous substances is exceeded. These standards represent airborne concentrations of substances which should neither impair the health of nor cause undue discomfort to nearly all workers. At this stage, it's really important to stress that we need to understand our professional boundaries, and this is very important to us as occupational health and safety practitioners. So the following quote is from NOSC from 1995. This is from the earlier version of the adopted exposure standards for atmospheric contaminants in the workplace. The evaluation of hazards posed by atmospheric contaminants in the working environment is often a complex task, requiring the consideration of a large number of variables, which determine the magnitude of a particular hazard. For this reason, it is essential that those persons responsible for these assessments are fully aware of all the issues canvassed in this document and have appropriate qualifications and experience in occupational hygiene. Atmospheric monitoring may be required as part of a risk assessment to determine whether or not the exposure of employees to airborne hazardous substances presents a risk to health. Monitoring may also form part of the risk control process, as it can assist in determining the controls required for a particular task. The estimation of personal exposure to hazardous substances is usually related to ensuring compliance with exposure standards. Monitoring is also carried out after manufacturing process modifications, changes to work practices that may adversely affect employee exposure, or as to check the efficacy of control measures. Monitoring is necessary prior to entry into confined spaces, which might contain toxic, inflammable, or explosive atmospheres, or be deficient in oxygen. It may be part of continuous process assessment, monitoring to ensure that a process involving highly dangerous substances is under continuous control, that there are no leaks, and that hazard control equipment is working effectively. In all cases, assessing the risk of exposure to chemical contaminants involves firstly correctly identifying the chemical hazard so that the appropriate monitoring can be determined. Atmospheric contaminants in a workplace are generally subject to rapid fluctuations in concentration depending on time, place, number of emission sources, air turbulence, the worker's environment, and work processes. Even one work shift may not be the same as another in the same workplace due to variability in the processes that influence concentrations of atmospheric contaminants. To determine personal exposure in this situation, sampling is required in the worker's breathing zone by means of personal sampling equipment. However, it is frequently too difficult, invasive, and costly to sample every worker on a daily basis. Thus, a suitable monitoring strategy should be implemented to obtain the maximum amount of useful exposure information at the minimum cost. This should be developed following a risk assessment, general walkthrough survey, and after the hazardous substances, the forms in which they occur, and the possible routes of exposure have all been identified and considered. The sampling and analytical methods selected must be capable of measuring the relevant substances with adequate sensitivity over the appropriate sampling periods without significant interference from other contaminants. Depending on the objectives of the survey, monitoring may be carried out at a number of different locations, for example in the worker's breathing zone, in the general workroom air, and during a specific operation. Since exposure standards refer to airborne concentrations of substances in the worker's breathing zone, the results of atmospheric monitoring can only be directly compared to the exposure standards if personal monitoring was performed in the breathing zone of an operator for an appropriate period of time, and the sample measured was representative of general exposure. Therefore, wherever possible, monitoring should be put in the form of personal sampling performed within the breathing zone of the operators. Often it's sufficient to collect an air sample at the location of lapel or breast pocket, but in some situations it's necessary to sample as close to the nose as possible. This is the case where a worker wears a visor, such as a welder's helmet, but it's also necessary when a worker is very close to the source of the emission and the exposure concentration gradient is very steep. Examples include close work with solvent-based adhesives and paints, hand sanding, grinding operations, and so on. The results of static or fixed position monitoring are only of limited use in determining the exposure of workers to a particular substance and should not be regarded as indicative of actual worker exposure. However, in certain circumstances, static or fixed position monitoring may be useful in the design of or in assessing the efficacy of control measures at a specific workstation or from a particular work process. The sampling duration is determined by the time basis of the exposure standard, as well as the length of the work shift or process and the technicalities of the analytical method. The sampling period should be representative of a full working day, which is assumed to be 8 hours. If the results are to be compared to an 8-hour TWA exposure standard, if a shorter sampling period, for example 4 hours, is employed, then the person carrying out the monitoring and interpreting the result must be certain that either no further significant exposure occurs for the remaining period or the 4-hour monitoring period is representative of the full shift. Since levels may vary throughout the day, sampling for shorter periods of time during an operation may sometimes provide additional useful information, which may assist in assessing the efficiency of control measures or in targeting control measures for the particular part of a process or operation. The duration of sampling should also take into account the method of analysis. Insufficient sampling time may mean the sample material is not detectable, while excessive sampling may overload the collector and provide redundant information. In a workplace where many workers are engaged in different jobs or different work units, sampling can be effectively carried out on a group basis. Workers should be divided into groups doing similar work, and air sampling is then carried out on a random sample of individuals from each group. Sufficient air samples should be collected to cover the whole range of activities and exposures within the group. In some special situations, such as when determining compliance with a regulatory standard or when settling disputes, worst-case monitoring may be used. In this sampling strategy, the conditions in which the greatest exposures occur should always be taken into account. Concentration on these conditions may allow a determination as to whether other exposures are acceptable, because this sampling will be assessing the highest potential exposures. Where there is no exposure standard, exposure should be controlled to the lowest practicable level. In this case, atmospheric monitoring may be useful for checking compliance with an in-house standard and for comparison after conditions have been altered. Atmospheric sampling devices. The sampling devices available can broadly be classified as those which sample particulates, such as dusts, mists and fumes, and those which sample gases and vapours in the air. These can be further categorised into direct reading type instruments, or devices which provide a relatively rapid result, and those devices that collect a sample, which requires laboratory analysis. The size of the particulate being measured also influences the instrument chosen. Sampling for particulates, filtration. The main types of particulates are dusts, including fibres, mists, which are aerosols, and fume. The two basic methods of sampling airborne particulates are filtration sampling and use of direct reading instruments. Filtration is the most common method for determining the time-weighted average concentration of an airborne particulate over an extended period of time. The sampling equipment aims to sample the reduction that enters the nose and is possibly deposited in the airways or lungs. This is referred to as inspirable dust. If the lung is the target organ, as is the case of fibrogenic dusts such as quartz, crystalline silica, then only that fraction of the particulate which can penetrate to the deep regions of the lung is important. This is called the respirable fraction. Fibres, such as asbestos and synthetic mineral fibres. The airborne concentration of asbestos fibres and synthetic mineral fibres, such as fiberglass, rock wool, and so on, are determined by a filter method. Airborne fibres are collected by filtration on a special membrane filter. The filter is then rendered transparent and the fibres counted under a microscope. The respirable fibre is one which is at least 5 micrometers in length and less than 3 micrometers in diameter, and has a length to diameter ratio of at least 3:1. The fibre concentration is expressed in fibres per milliliter of air. Since discriminating between respirable and non-respirable fibres is done at the counting stage, a simple collector consisting of a downward-facing open-face filter and protective cowl is used. Further details are available in the following publications from Safe Work Australia: The Code of Practice for the Safe Removal of Asbestos, the Code of Practice for the Management and Control of Asbestos in the Workplace, and can guide us note on the membrane filter method for estimating airborne asbestos fibres. Liquid aerosols, mists and sprays. Filter methods can be used, although bubblers or impingers are often more suitable. Bubblers are vessels which are suitable for trapping liquid that absorbs the contaminant as air is bubbled or drawn through the liquid. Bubblers can also be used to collect certain gases and vapours. Sampling for particulates, direct reading instruments. Another method for monitoring particulates involves the use of instruments which give a direct reading of the particulate concentration at any instance of time, and may or may not provide an average concentration over the measurement period. Compared with the filtration method, direct reading instruments have the advantage that localized peaks of concentration can be identified and remedial measures put into effect immediately. A disadvantage is that the calibration of these instruments tends to be questionable, as it is dependent upon the type and size distribution of the particles sampled. The readings shown by such instruments may thus be erroneous or misleading. The equipment also tends to be relatively expensive. Sampling for gases and vapours. A number of sampling systems are available for gases and vapours, and several factors decide the appropriate sample method to be used. A direct reading instrument usually takes a grab sample, usually sampling for a few seconds or a minute or two, and therefore measuring atmospheric conditions at a particular point in time. There are many direct reading instruments and methods available, ranging from simple techniques using colorimetric detector tubes to expensive instruments which can be coupled to recording systems. Some sampling methods include colorimetric detector tubes, instrumental methods, electronic gas detectors, selective sample collection techniques followed by lab analysis, passive sampling, and active sampling. Selective sampling collection techniques. This method involves sampling a known volume of air over an extended period of time and passing it through a trapping medium, such as a bubbler, to remove the desired gases or vapours from the air. The sample is then analysed in a laboratory. The rate and period of sampling is chosen so that sufficient quantity of the substance is collected from the air for subsequent laboratory analysis. Active and passive sampling. Sampling procedures may involve either active or passive sampling techniques. Active sampling involves the use of a pump to draw air through the collection medium. This is in contrast to passive sampling, which relies on the diffusion or permeation of gases or vapours into the sampler.